Hey YouTubers, and welcome back to Tony the Technician channel, and today we're going to be going back into the 3rd gen Camaro, and just like the title says, this is another episode of the rear end swap, or part 2. In the first video, we went over removing the rear end and then how to remove it, whether you're just swapping the rear end or if you're replacing all of the rear suspension like I am. So in my case, I removed the rear end, removed the lower control arms, upper and lower Panhard bar, all that good stuff. And then while I had it out, I had to drop the fuel tank. I had to drain the fuel because it's like 6 years old. So I drained the fuel. I undercoated the car as best as possible. It looks a lot better. I had to reroute the transcooler lines and all of that, get everything prepped, and then I reinstalled the fuel tank and heat shielding and all of that. So now we're ready to reinstall or install the new rear end, or the Hawks 8.8. I also have a video on it if you guys would like more details on the Hawks 8.8 and the options I went with and all of that. But no more 10 bolt in with the Hawks 8.8. We'll be installing it with new lower control arms, upper and lower Panhard bars, coilovers, a new drag sway bar, and all that fancy stuff. So everything's pretty easy to install, nothing real difficult. I've already installed the upper Panhard bar. It's very simple, and I've already hung one of the coilovers. I'm thinking I'm going to install those first, so then when I get the rear end in, I can just kind of lift everything up. And then the last thing we'll be doing is installing like the universal parking brake cables and everything. Other than that, I really hope you guys enjoy it. I might split this video into 2 pieces depending on how long it is, but I think we'll be able to get it all done. But if you guys have any questions, comments, concerns on anything, the parts I went with, how to install them, maybe I forget to go over something or anything like that, please feel free to drop a comment down below. I love interacting with you guys. So let's go ahead and get this installed, and that's it. So here's everything we're going to be installing. I have one of the coilovers already installed on the driver's side. Here's the Hawks 8.8. Here's the old 10 bolt. Working on the exhaust, got it tacked up. I test fitted it. Now I just need to get it fully welded. We got the universal parking brake cables that we'll be installing, the Founders lower Panhard bar, lower control arms, the rear drag sway bar, new torque arm bolts that are a little bit longer to fit aftermarket torque arms that have a little bit thicker gauge steel. But as far as the upper Panhard bar, it is installed. So you just have these brackets over here that mount one inside, one outside, and you may or may not have to drill these holes out. I had to drill out the bottom hole there to get that bolt through. It says in the instructions, so no big deal. But the upper Panhard bar, instead of going to that upper bolt location here, it now sits here, and then the lower Panhard bar will go there. So it's the relocation bracket installed, and then I got new hardware on the other side as well. Got everything undercoated as best as possible. Got the new fuel tank vent on there. The transcooler lines routed best as possible. Here's the coilover. As you can see, it's just kind of hanging, and it just kind of sits. That mount sits where in that spring cup, basically where your old spring would go. The top of your spring sits right in there. This bracket now sits there, and then one bolt from that bracket feeds up through and into the inside of the car. So, and that just holds the coilover. So like I was showing you, this bracket, this part sits in the spring cup, and then this threaded portion goes up through into where your shock used to mount, and then you just tighten that down. And then all of this is already tightened down. The only thing we'll have to do is attach this once we get the rear end in, and I already have the lower mounts bolted onto the new rear end as well. So now we just have to start. We'll get the rear end under there after I get this coilover in, and then we can start attaching the lower control arms and all of that. So if you have one of these little wooden dollies, which you can get at Harbor Freight for like $20, makes things super easy. I used it to remove the old rear end, and we're going to use it to move the new one in. I do think I forgot to mention, as far as the upper Panhard bar, if you guys are replacing this is the one from Founders, and it's got the relocation bracket. This hardware right here is 119 foot-pounds. I think on the 3 bolts on the other side, it was 35 foot-pounds. I can't remember for sure, so don't take my word on it for the other side. But the instructions do state 119 foot-pounds for these. And then I had to contact Founders. You can see I have the coilovers installed. I had to contact them for the torque specs on those because I could not find it anywhere online, because you're not simply just bolting a Viking coilover into the stock mounts or anything like that. They have custom mounts for the rear end, and the ones that I just showed you a little bit ago that sit up in the cup up there. And there's one bolt that feeds through up into the top. Well, all the 1/2 inch drive hardware, which is this one, the bolt on the top, and then the bolt that goes through the top, those are all 1/2 inch, which are 80 foot-pounds. And then I believe this one is 1/2 inch drive as well. And then this one's 3/8, which they state the 3/8 is 33 foot-pounds, I believe. So there's the torque specs on that, but to get the rear end in. There we go, we're installed. I wish, but really, it's not that difficult. We're just gonna start slapping in the new suspension components, get it bolted up, this thing finished up. So getting the torque arm on wasn't quite as easy. I had to move my dollies to the outsides because obviously I needed to get this on where my dolly was sitting directly underneath. So that wasn't possible. I do have the first bolt in. This is the bolt kit from Hawks Motorsports. And we're in. So I did have to kind of work around this brake line, and it's close to the brake line over here, but it's all clear. And the Hawks bolt kit actually has a little bit longer bolts to make up for this thick gauge steel here on the UMI torque arm, so we have plenty of threads on the bottom, and we're good to go here. Now we can start working on the rest. This is I'm basically working backwards from the removal of the old rear end. So now we can go ahead, put these on. As far as torque specs, what I've found is about 100 foot-pounds. So I'm gonna go ahead and torque these down to 100 foot-pounds. Do a little bit more research because some of these components are hard to find torque specs on, but I'll try and give you guys some pretty decent and accurate information, but always make sure to double check. It also depends on the size of the fastener. If you're using aftermarket fasteners, aftermarket parts, you don't always go with the factory torque specs unless stated. So I try and find the maker of the component, what they recommend, and then if not, then I'll go with the factory torque specs. Now we've got the torque arm torqued down, attached to the rear end. So then I went ahead and I slid my jack underneath the center section and lifted it up a little bit. Now we're going to install the lower control arms, and depending whether you are using stock or depending on the brand, depending on the hardware they send you, I believe this is 7/16. Torque specs range anywhere from like 68 to 80 foot-pounds on the lower control arms. I know 1/2 inch, a lot of the times it's 80 foot-pounds. 3/8 is much lower. So with this hardware, I'm gonna go with about 70, 75 foot-pounds, and then I'm gonna just do some more research. Once again, you know, don't always take somebody's word for it. Do your own research, find out what fits your needs the best if your stuff doesn't include torque specs. So a lot of my rear suspension, the lower control arms, the Panhard bar, both upper and lower, are all Founders, made in the USA, and then I have Spohn, the rear drag sway bar, and all of that. So I have a mix of everything, but we're gonna go ahead and get these installed. And then with these, I did just go ahead and adjust them to the length of my lower control arms that I had installed before, which I had matching stock. So until I can get this thing on an alignment rack and get it broken in and everything, then we'll figure out the necessary adjustments. But for now, I'm just gonna go ahead and go with the length that I have preset. So yeah, that side started. Now I can go ahead and mount it to the rear end, which you have a few different mounting locations here, which is nice that they installed this bracket so you don't have to buy a lower control arm relocation bracket or anything. It's already all welded and built into it. So we're gonna go, a lot of the guys I've seen are starting with the second from the bottom, so that's what we're gonna start with, and we'll adjust from there. Alright, so now I'll just come in and I'll torque both ends of the lower control arm. Now we really only have a couple things left. We have to install the bolt for the lower portion of the coilover right down here. And then we need to install the rear Panhard bar and then basically brake lines. So now we're going to, here if you're not running coilovers, this is where you could install your springs and shocks and then lift up the rear end. I've already lifted up the rear end to where it basically lines up as far as my coilover bottom mount. So as you're raising it, just make sure you got your spring in the spring pocket and everything, and you got it clocked the right direction and get your shocks remounted and all of that. As far as this, we don't have to worry about the springs since we're running coilovers. So and now we'll just go ahead and torque that down, and then we can move on to the lower Panhard bar and sway bar. Before we get this lower Panhard bar installed, I do want to mention, so if you guys remember, I did have to drill out one side of this bracket to a larger hole to fit this new hardware, installing the Panhard rod. The stock hardware is actually a necked down bolt, so you have a 14 millimeter portion up here and it's necked down to 12 millimeters. If you're running the stock hardware, you're gonna have no issues. Now with these in here like this, the clearance between the mounting point and this might be too tight. You might have to open up that with like a punching hammer, or like I did, I actually went in and lightly filed down the top portion of these to create clearance, and worked perfectly. The other issue I ran into, new upgraded hardware, it's not a neck down bolt, so it's 14 millimeter all the way through. Problem being, not only do you have to open up the holes on the rear end and the bracket on this side, but one of these spacers is 14, one is 12, and that goes for both sides. So that makes it really hard for a 14 millimeter bolt to pass through a 12 millimeter hole. So I had to get a 9/16 drill bit and open up two of these to the same as the other, just slightly over 14 millimeter. So now our hardware passes through all of our aluminum spacers. And then I realized my old Panhard rod has stainless steel ones, which are already at 14 millimeters. So I could use these as backups, but I'm going to use the billet aluminum ones that came with it now that I have them filed and opened up to the necessary size for the new hardware. Once again, if you're running the stock hardware, you're not going to have a problem. Other than that, just something I wanted to mention before we get it installed. We're getting ready to install the Panhard bar now, and one thing I did notice that I should mention that I did incorrectly. Not a big deal, but it is important. These bolts here, I actually installed backwards. So anytime you install a bolt that faces front to rear, you do want to install the bolt from the front to the rear, so it's less likely to come out. The only time you would install it this direction is if you're limited on space here and you can't get a fastener in this direction. After I'm done here, I will go back and turn these bolts around to where the nuts are on this side. So on this one, I actually can't get the bolt in from the front, so I'll have to go from the rear. The only way I could is if I drop the rear end out or lower it below, so I could get the fastener in here. But in this case, if the fastener did back out, it would run into the bracket for the spring perch, or the spring perch, and it wouldn't be able to back out completely. So we're gonna have to go this direction with this one, and then these two I can flip around the other direction. So here on the driver's side, I have drilled out the hole. So this side already comes as a 14 millimeter, but like I stated, the stock bolt gets necked down to a 12 millimeter. So this inside hole is actually originally a 12 millimeter. So I've drilled that out to match the other side. And now we'll just go in and torque down the fasteners and move on to the sway bar. We're going to be installing the rear drag sway bar from Spohn, and these are the sway bar end links. They are adjustable spherical rod ends, and this is the part that will bolt to the sway bar itself. This is the bracket that bolts to the car up here, and I have went ahead and just chased the holes, cleaned them out. They are M10 by 1.5 for the thread pitch, so just make sure that you're using the right hardware. My car, like I said before, did not have a sway bar, so I didn't have the stock mounts on there or anything. So there are only a few sway bars out there with mounts that actually just bolt right in. But if you go with a different sway bar, you can, unlike Hawks, you can get the stock replacement for the sway bar brackets that actually bolt up here. But I just decided to go this route. So to start off with, we're just gonna remove this, and then I'm gonna take my hardware and just simply, I have a lock washer on here, and I'm gonna put some blue Loctite on them as well. They do even suggest after installing these that you go ahead and get this plate welded to the car, and I may do that after I get the car running and on the road. So for now, I'm just gonna bolt it in with these lock washers and a little bit of blue thread lock, and it's as simple as that. So we have the actual mounting plates tightened down, but this fastener here is not. I just have it loose right now. Then this is just loose. I just kind of hung the sway bar on here, so we'll have to tighten that up later. But it's basically just sitting here. I have it kind of bolted up on both sides just to kind of hold it in place. So we're just simply going to take our sway bar bushings. We're going to use the supplied grease, the super lube. This comes with it. I also have another tube of it, so we'll just lube these bushings up nicely, and then basically I'm just going to hold the sway bar up. This is normally a two-man job because of how heavy this sway bar is, but since I have it supported on both sides, we're just going to lift it up. I'm going to put one bushing up and hold it, and then we'll install the other one. Should be pretty simple. But we're not going to tighten anything down yet because you need to center it left to right and front to back. So you want to make sure that it's basically center below your axle tubes, and then you want to make sure that there's the same distance between the sway bar and your any kind of bracket, basically. So whether you go from your coilover or your shock or the mounting part, I just want to make sure that there's the same distance from the sway bar to here, sway bar, same distance on both sides, so we know it's equal left to right and centered underneath the axle tubes. So other than that, just installing this, and then we'll go back once I get it centered up, and then we'll tighten down all of the hardware. Alrighty, so that's it as far as the install of the Hawks 8.8 all new suspension components. So obviously if you're just installing the Hawks 8.8, it's a lot less work than this. We installed the upper and lower Panhard bars, Spohn rear drag sway bar, the Founders and the upper and lower Panhard bar are both from Founders, and then Founders lower control arms, all spherical rod ends, the Viking coilovers. So I'm extremely happy with it. The only thing that we haven't done is connect the hard brake line to the flex line that splits on the rear end, which is simple enough, which I'll include that and the installation of the parking brake cables in the next video. I will have a separate video installing the Willwood rear brake kit for this, so I'll show you what I went with for this rear end and how to install it, and I really hope you guys enjoyed this install. If you guys have any questions, comments, concerns, please feel free to drop a comment down below. Keep in mind, I only mentioned certain torque specs throughout this video because you install stuff like this, it's not necessarily going to be factory torque specs. It's going to depend on the fastener size that you go with or what is provided to you. So it's going to vary from component to component just depending on what brand you go with and what hardware you end up going with for that. So that's it, and I really hope you guys enjoyed. After we get the rear brake kit installed, we'll go ahead and get the wheels and tires put on it. I'll preload the rear drag sway bar and get the rear end centered and all of that good stuff. So stay tuned, and if you guys enjoyed, please make sure to hit that thumbs up, leave a comment down below, and as always, subscribe if you're not a subscriber. See you guys next time.